When I was 12, I was sleeping over at my best friend's house in the woods. They lived in a development that was very slowly being built. Lots of dense trees and half-built houses we called the skeleton houses. Sometimes we trespassed into the skeleton houses and pretended murders happened there, or that we were hunting ghosts. Early in the night, we had a big pasta dinner with her mom and watched The Lord of the Rings. We were obsessed with it, including with the cast, and we teased each other about our crushes on Legolas and Aragorn. We had a lot of sleepovers like this, and would get so caught up in our little world of fantasy and junk food and just laughing together. Her mom always went to bed super early, so we were left to our own designs. We snuck out, whispering and trying not to laugh too hard. We walked the circle of road with a maple grove in the center. She had no neighbors next to her on any side, and on the far end of the road there were two half-built houses. When we got into one of the skeleton houses, we made sure to be extra quiet. We got caught by her dad one time when he was home from his job as a trucker. He could hear our laughter echoing off the walls of the skeleton house through his open window. My best friend and I sat in the middle of a big, empty, walk-in basement and pretended to summon spirits. We both pretended to actually believe it, but we could see the laughter in each other's eyes. And eventually, we did start laughing, but to keep our voices from echoing off the walls, our laughter sounded like panting, hiccups, and hissing. Our laughter died down, but as we caught our breath, the sound of panting continued. My best friend and I were so close we were on the same frequency. We looked at each other at that moment, then straight through the frame that would soon be a window. Amber eyes glowed through the window frame. This was not a low window, but a window for a window well, intended to let light in, but too tall to look out of. The eyes peered through the frame. The three of us froze. I recognized a nearly human intelligence in those eyes, and also a frenzied hunger. Then we heard scratching, and the creature began scrambling to get through the window. That's when we saw its snout and jaw, huge and agape, panting and drooling. Its lips pulled back, and it growled so low and menacingly, it vibrated in my bones. We ran, having just enough time to get some distance between us, but we heard its footsteps behind us, each booming step followed by the scratch of claws against the floor. My best friend and I ran out the front door into the night, which was lit by a half moon. I looked back and saw it step onto the front steps on two legs. It was like a giant wolf balanced on its back legs. I thought for a moment it was just going to stand there, but then it dropped to all fours and sprinted after us. My best friend and I barely made it through the front door when she closed it, and the creature slammed into it hard. At this point, we were holding on to each other and crying as it scratched rapidly at the door. We ran into her bedroom, shut the door, and hid in the closet. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off, and I guess we passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, as we sat at the breakfast table, hardly able to speak from shock, her mom went out the front door to get the mail. When she came back in, she had a surprised look on her face, and she wanted to know if we heard any animals outside last night. We said no. I still have this image in my mind of her shaking her head in disbelief and staring at the scratch marks on the open door. It's been over 6 years since this happened, but I still wake up in a cold sweat every now and then. My girlfriend, now wife, and I were going through a tough time. Her father just died, and I had lost about 2 weeks of planning. We found a good time and spot. In that 2 week period, I managed to get my license back, so that was good. For this story, I won't give my girlfriend's real name for privacy reasons, so her name will be Elizabeth. We packed all the essentials we would need for a week out in the woods: tents, clothing, first aid kit, flashlights, a lighter, food, cooler, knives, a machete, $150 for an emergency, playing cards, a guitar, etc. Also, I brought a CZ USA 85 combat pistol, just in case. Thank God I did. We packed all of our things into the car and we were on our way. I'll spare you the 4-hour drive. We stopped at a Burger King about 9 miles away from our destination to recharge our batteries and stretch. Elizabeth pulled out her phone and looked at the weather, only to see that it was going to rain for the entire week. "Great. Now what are we going to do?" she asked. "I guess we should get to the campsite to set up the tents before it's too late," I suggested. We did just that. When we got to the campsite, it started to rain a bit, so we started to unpack as fast as we could. While we were unpacking, we noticed that this campsite was recently used, and the people who were previously there had no respect for nature. There was garbage everywhere. Every third step you would hit a can of beer or a plastic bag. And I think at one point I saw an unopened box of tampons. The wind started to pick up too, so all the trash began to fly around in random directions. When we finally got the tent set up and things inside, the rain really started to come down. We managed to secure the tent well, but the rain fly almost blew off. While Elizabeth remained inside to set up the cots, I went out with my poncho and a hammer to secure the rainfly. While pounding the stakes into the ground, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I don't know why. I just felt uneasy. It was as if something was watching me over my shoulder, and I didn't know. By now it was getting pretty dark. If I had to guess, it was about 8:45-ish. I finished securing the rainfly and was about to head inside when I heard a howl a distance away. I thought it might be wolves, but sounded off, like a cross between a scream from a human and a howl from a coyote. I got goosebumps. I headed inside and zipped the door shut. Elizabeth and I snuggled until we both fell asleep. For the next 2 days, nothing too eventful happened, but the third night is when it appeared. There was no rain that night either. As we were sleeping, I woke up to the same howl I had heard 2 days prior. But the thing that scared me the most is that it was closer. I shook Elizabeth's shoulder to wake her up. She gave me a partial half-asleep stare. "Babe, there's something out the—" I was cut off by the howl again, but now it was like 200 yards away. That was enough to wake her. She sat up with sweat pouring down her face and shirt. "Why is it coming towards us?" said Elizabeth with fear in her eyes. That's when it dawned on me. We left some food outside after making dinner. It was probably going for our food. We sat in the tent, holding each other, shaking with fear in pitch-black dark. All of a sudden, we hear the growl again, but it was deafening. It was at our campsite. We heard it walking around looking for the food. Well, it found it. We heard what sounded like muffled screaming and loud thumping as it devoured our rations. Elizabeth hugged me tight and cried into my shoulder. I was frozen, just staring into the direction of the noise. The thing kept making these noises and screaming for like 3 minutes, until Elizabeth sobbed into me making some noise. The thing stopped eating. It knew we were there. I embraced Elizabeth and started to silently cry, too. This thing actually started to walk towards us. I thought, if I'm going to die here, I won't go down without a fight. I felt around for 2 things, my flashlight and my gun. I found those 2 in about 2 seconds, turned my flashlight and pointed it in the direction the thing was. What I saw made me scream. I saw the silhouette of a creature the size of a full-grown German shepherd, but way skinnier through my tent wall. What scared me the most is that it stood up on its hind legs and began to touch the tent. I snapped out of it and took 1 shot at the thing. Bang! It let out the most haunting, blood-curdling scream. I can't even describe it in words. I kid you not, it turned around and ran away on 2 legs. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, fearing it might come back. Luckily, it didn't, but we still heard its screams. At the crack of dawn, we grabbed all we could, jumped into my car, and drove out of the area as fast as we could. There was no time to even dismantle the tent. We ended up staying in a hotel for the rest of the trip. That spare cash we brought was worth it. We ended up leaving half our stuff in the woods, but we didn't care. During the whole car ride out of the area, Elizabeth was crying and hugging my arm. After we returned home, we moved 1 month later. Elizabeth ended up going to therapy for 4 months to recover. We now have a baby boy and are living far away from our old home and the woods. We actually have a fear of camping now, but we live in a city, so there's no problem. If anybody knows what we saw, please let me know. And may God return the thing we saw back to its home. Hell. I was a foster kid growing up in a small, rural community. I bounced around to half a dozen homes, but ended up staying with one family from middle school until I aged out of the system. Even now, we keep in contact, and they have been a huge support in my life. My room was in the basement of my foster parents' house, not because I was like Harry Potter and shunned down there. They had a bed set up for me in their son's room, who was close to my age, but I really like my privacy down in the musty guest room. One of the perks of my room being down there was that I could sneak out of the steps that led to the big metal doors. I'd push them up and open and sneak out to meet up with my buddies. We mostly hung out in the woods because even if we weren't being sneaky teenagers and drinking or smoking, it was the only place to hang out locally. Sometimes my buddies would bring their girlfriends, and they'd bring their friends, and we'd drink beer around a fire at a camping spot that me and my buddies cleared out. But most of the time we were hanging out sober and doing things like clearing out wood to make that spot. One summer, we were so bored, we all got shovels and just dug a hole in the woods. I know, it sounds stupid, but we were bored teenage boys with so much pent-up energy, we had to get it out some way that wasn't destructive. So, the summer we dug the hole, we went camping one night. Our camp spot was out of sight of the hole, but easily within walking distance, even at night if you had a flashlight. We were just hanging out, and we'd bring our guitars and jam. It got late, and we were putting out the fire and going to sleep when we heard a roar in the distance. But it wasn't just a roar. It had this high-pitched whine at the end, like whatever kind of animal it was hurt. We all froze. Then we heard whimpering like a canine, maybe a coyote, we thought. But my friend, I'll call him Jay, said, "That sounds bigger than a coyote." Well, we all go together to investigate, realizing that an animal probably fell into the hole we were digging. We get to the hole, which was probably about 6 feet deep and 6 feet wide. I shined my flashlight in. The biggest dog I have ever seen was at the bottom. It looked up at us with big eyes that were kinda human-like. It rose onto its back legs, and we could see its front paw was injured. What really freaked us out was that this wolf-like creature's shoulders were like a human's, and its paws didn't stick out in front when it reared back, like a dog's would, but its arms came out the sides like human shoulders. In fact, it looked like it belonged on 2 legs, not 4. We all watched it silently for a moment, and then the creature began to growl and bared its giant white teeth. We ran the hell out of there and even left our stuff at the campsite. We stayed away from the campsite for a few weeks. Then one day, Jay and I went back to see if our tents were destroyed by the elements. We went in the day, thinking that the creature, if it was still stuck in the hole, would have been dead by now. That made me feel horrible. Also, what the hell was it? It was terrifying. The hole was empty when we got there. The creature had definitely been tall enough to crawl out, just its front paw was injured. Over the next few weeks, we all chipped in to refill the hole. We didn't want any other animals, terrifying or otherwise, to fall in the hole. I don't think we ever went camping at that spot again. This was about 23 years ago, and I had no clue what a dogman was, and didn't believe in anything supernatural back then. I was hunting wild hogs in one of the southernmost areas of the Great Dismal Swamp. This is far south of the wildlife refuge, where it ends at the Albemarle Sound in eastern North Carolina. I was back there about 2 hours looking for signs of hogs. I could tell something had been back there at some point, but it had been a while. I got a little further in and started smelling what I had thought was a boar. It's rutting season, and male wild hogs have a very distinct smell. It's musky and kind of fermented, mixed with old poop and urine. Kind of hard to explain if you've never smelled it before. However, this was different. It was musky, but more like an outside dog that's soaking wet. I stopped to look and listen, and after 10 or so minutes, I started hearing a snuffling breathing that came and went. After a bit, I started to hear some growling. I started to get a little freaked out because it didn't sound like a hog, and it sounded big. I stopped again and knelt down and waited and looked around. Where I was at, the brush was pretty thick, so I really couldn't see more than 20 or so feet in any direction. That's when I started seeing movement. It definitely wasn't moving like a hog. It was kinda low, walking crouched down, but not on all fours, and I was only getting glimpses of it, and it would stop. It was probably about 40 feet away. This is when I actually started getting scared. I was born in northeastern Kentucky and spent most of my free time as a kid in the woods, camping, riding dirt bikes, and have always been comfortable, even in the deep woods. So when I moved to North Carolina, I fell in love with the swamp. This is the first time I think I had ever felt real and actual fear. I had a Mossberg 590 shotgun full of 3-inch 00 buckshot. but no extra shells and no pistol. The 590 also has a bayonet lug, so I took out the bayonet and put it on. After a bit, I realized that this thing has gotten between me and the way I came in from my boat, and I'm starting to panic. I try to start getting further away from it and headed in the right direction. And then I see it again, and it's standing up, and it's pretty damn tall. It was still back in the brush, so I couldn't really make out any details, as it's dark as hell back there. I wanted to cry and run, but I knew that was a bad idea. It didn't seem like it wanted to get in the water, so I started wading through the canal, headed back towards my boat. I started to put some distance between it and myself, so I got back on hard ground to move a little faster, but I can still hear it snuffing and growling and moving through the brush, but it's not close anymore. I made it back to my boat, and I'm soaking wet and freezing, but I thank God I made it out of there, and just in time as it's getting foggy and starting to drizzle. I had never been that scared in my life. I made it back to my buddy's house and tell him what happened, and I can tell he knows something when I tell him where I went. He brings me in and gives me some hot coffee and a big slug of bourbon in it. When I calm down, he takes me to the other house out back of his property to where his granddad lives. I'd met his granddad before, but he had always been kind of standoffish to me. He, my buddy, and his family had lived in that area since after the Civil War. I think his granddad's great-granddad may have been a slave around there, but that's a story for another day. I guess what I mean to say is his family had history in that area and knew the place a lot better than me. After I told his granddad what happened, he stood up, looked me in the eye, and said, "Don't go back in there. You're lucky you made it out. That's where the big dogs live." I left and went home and slept for 18 hours. I tried to forget about that experience and started to believe I was just seeing things and freaked myself out. I eventually forgot all about it until a few years ago. So that's my story. I'm 44 now and still live in coastal North Carolina, but haven't been back anywhere close to that area. I still hunt and love the outdoors and the swamp, but don't go too far in anymore. Thanks for joining me, Madam Horror, for your bedtime scary stories. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like and subscribe buttons. It helps a lot. If you have a story you would like read on this channel, send it to me at madamhorror1@gmail.com. Join me next week for more stories of the unknown.